Good evening. Welcome to the British Society of Magazine Editors and this very special event. It's called Exposing the Post Office Scandal and the Power of Investigative Journalism. So we're here at the Bankside Hotel Autograph Collection. Thanks to them for hosting today, and I really enjoyed going around the artwork earlier. I'm Gideon Spanier. I'm the chair of the BSME, and I'm also the UK Editor-in-Chief of Campaign magazine. So this is my first event as chair, and we've picked three themes for this year, and they are responsible, trusted journalism, the importance of editorial innovation, and the need to keep pushing for greater inclusion in our industry, and I think in our reporting. But when you think of an example of trusted journalism, I think it's hard to think of any better example than the post office. It's one of the worst miscarriages in British legal history, some say the worst, and magazine journalism played a key role in revealing it. So I am totally delighted to welcome this brilliant panel. Brilliant. I was going to make, and Ian knows this, a bad joke about have I got news for you teams, but on this team is Rebecca Thomson, who is a journalist and a former Computer Weekly reporter who broke the first story about the post office scandal in 2009. Rebecca, Bryan Glick is the editor-in-chief of Computer Weekly, and he's been editor-in-chief since 2009, although I think he joined just after Rebecca's piece. Ian Hislop is the editor of Private Eye. I checked if I'm allowed to say this, since 1986. Rosamund Urwin is media editor of the Sunday Times and a top reporter who published an investigation into Russell Brand and allegations about his treatment of women last year. So we're going to discuss why a magazine mentality can sometimes be the best way to investigate a story. We'll look more broadly at the power of investigative journalism and also about legal threats and other challenges. And we'll also ask, why did it take a hit ITV drama, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, to catapult the scandal right to the top of the national news agenda? So I'm going to start with Rebecca, because that's the way we should. So I mentioned your story in 2009. Tell us how the story came about, because it was a slow burn, right?
Yeah, it was a very slow burn. So it started in 2004, which is when Alan Bates wrote to our then executive editor, Tony Collins. Tony couldn't do anything in 2004 because it was only one source, but he kept the letter. And then in 2008, when Lee Castleton wrote to us, he sort of connected them. He gave me both letters, and it went from there. And I spoke to Alan, spoke to Tony, and then found other postmasters. That's it in a nutshell. But it was all down to Tony, really, I think.
And I think we've got an image. I know we do. This is the cover story. Bankruptcy, prosecution, disrupted livelihoods. And then we can go inside, and this is the opening of the spread, postmasters under stress. And can you see from there, Rebecca, you got 7 case studies. Do you want to just mention that?
Yeah, we had 7, and I think we had others. I can't remember how many it was, but it was quite a lot more who just wouldn't go on the record because it was quite a scary thing to do, obviously. So we had a lot more, which at least made us feel more comfortable.
And there are a lot of journalists and editors in the room so that's 4 years from from the magazine receiving its first tip-off. So when you get a tip-off in writing, keep it.
Yeah, no matter how random it seems. Yeah.
We know that Alan Bates was and is a man on a mission. So I can't remember if he'd started agitating in 1998. This was a long old process.
Yeah.
One of the stories associated with the post office are the sort of repeated denials all along. So right on that first story, what was it like? And you, by the way, may I say, you were quite a young reporter at the time.
Yeah, 24, I think, when I first started working on it. They just lied a lot. It was aggressive. They did it for a long time, and they did it successfully. It was a really successful campaign of denial.
But I mean, didn't they make a complaint about you?
Yes, I can't remember exactly how it came, but I think they emailed Bill, who was the news editor at the time. There were several emails complaining. The whole team, I think, pretty much from the start, believed in the story, which sort of feels quite surprising now in a way, because they obviously weren't speaking to the postmasters, and it was speaking to the postmasters that convinced me that there was something in it and they were telling the truth. So I think it was the culture at Computer Weekly and the type of people that the editors were that meant that they believed in it and kept behind it.
And I'm going to come to Bryan in a minute, but when we were talking also, I think you talked about a sort of the culture at Computer Weekly at that time, being a team. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, they prided themselves on investigative stuff. Tony had done a lot on NHS IT and had won lots of awards, and it had got Computer Weekly a strong reputation, and they were really proud of that, obviously, quite rightly. So it was just part of what they did, part of what they wanted to do more of. And I think certainly in quite a lot of the newsrooms that I've worked in, it's not always the case. Even if somewhere is really strong in other ways, it's not always the case that they prioritise investigative stuff. And certainly, I guess in 2009 as well, it was relatively unusual. I think it was sort of part of what they felt made them stand out.
And I guess as we see the ITV drama and everything else, were you surprised at the reaction or the non-reaction to the story? Because we all know sometimes some of us don't break that many stories, but when you do break one, you're not always sure what's going to happen.
Yeah, no, we were disappointed, but we should have taken it to Ian. I don't think we did. I don't know why we didn't. But yeah, we were very disappointed by it. But it was, again, the post office. If journalists were calling, asking what was going on, the post office were lying and telling off the record that it was that we'd got the wrong end of the stick, and but it was disappointing.
All right, well, we'll obviously bring in Ian in a moment. Also, it's really interesting, the question about collaboration. I talked about teamwork within a publication, but when it's teamwork or collaboration, some pros, maybe some cons. So, Bryan, like we said, you joined Computer Weekly soon afterwards, but you'd already been a technology computer journalist, and you actually, I'm fairly sure, knew the predecessor company to Fujitsu pretty well.
Yeah. I actually used to work for them when I was younger. So I did a computer science degree. My first job out of university was ICL, which was the company that then became Fujitsu. I hasten to add, I left before all this happened, a long time before all this happened. It did give me some pretty good insights into that sort of organisation. I think one of the ironies was, anybody who'd been working in technology journalism during that decade leading up to Rebecca's first story knew that big, complex IT systems went wrong. They went wrong all the time. There was Tony wrote about loads of them. I'd written about loads of them before I came to Computer Weekly, and we continue to do so. So, from our perspective, the fact that this big IT system might not be working was A, not a surprise, and B, most likely true.
But was it difficult to tell the story? I mean, obviously, your B2B title, you've got a knowledgeable audience, but I think it was Nick Wallace, a freelance journalist who's done a lot of work with the BBC and so on, who said it's actually quite a complicated story, and maybe some people would go boring, it's an IT system, rather than going, it's affecting all these individuals' lives. Was it complicated to tell?
Yeah, it was complicated to tell. It was complicated to tell, but particularly in a way that would instantly engage people. And I think that was obviously one of the big issues around the struggle that you had and that we had for the years after in getting wider interest to it. I think at the time, people would tend to, especially at that time, people would think, computers, either, computers, God, boring, or computers, that's really complicated, I don't really understand that. don't forget at the time, the post office's marketing tagline on all its adverts and everything at the time was Britain's most trusted brand. That's this, they had surveys to prove they were Britain's most trusted brand at that time. So I can remember telling friends and family about this story, and they were like, "The post office? Really? Are you sure? Really?" And there was that to overcome as well. But without doubt, the fact that we were a specialist title who had people who understood something about technology certainly helped. When I joined, I was aware of the story because I'd read it. I was working for another publication before then, and I'd read it and thought, that's a great story. And then when I joined Computer Weekly and talked to Rebecca more about it and learnt more about the story, there was always two things that stood out. One was the thing that we all know now, and it was featured so well in the drama and featured brilliantly in Rebecca's first story, was the fact that the post office told every single person, "You're the only one who's having this problem." And Rebecca was the first person who was able to talk to all those people, hear them say that, and put that together. Now, any of us, I'm sure, as a journalist, will see something like that. You don't need to know anything about technology. You see that as a journalist, you think, now something's not right there. That's going to get the red alerts going. But the other thing, from my perspective, which perhaps was where we could bring something to it, was what the post office was telling us was fundamentally flawed. They were saying, if there was a problem with the IT, we've got 12,500 branches. If there was a problem with the computer, we would see it across all our branches. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how IT goes wrong. If 12,500 branches saw it, they would all see it instantly. They would find the problem and they would sort it. The problems that kill you are the ones that are almost impossible to replicate, that come up when somebody hits the wrong combination of keys or this sort of thing. So there was always this fundamental flaw in their argument on the basis that they were making about to try and justify that Horizon was this amazing, perfect system that they claimed it was.
I remember, I think a private eye headline was "Computer Says No." And the first, Ian, am I right? The first story was by, I don't know if it was Byline, because I don't think it was the Byline, but Richard Brooks in 2011. Is that right? And again, yeah. Well, Rebecca said an interesting point. We may come back to that on collaboration. So you ran the story in 2011, and again, it's amazing rereading it, how, like Rebecca's story, you had basically many of the key facts in the story right there, including the fact that the minister at the time, Ed Davey, had basically just disregarded the story and shunted it. So I don't know if you say anything about how the story came to the eye.
Yeah, well, Richard Brooks.
You have to use your mic, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I've got such a loud voice. Is that better? Yeah. Richard Brooks, who is the journalist who's written all our stuff about the post office, latterly in collaboration with Nick Wallace. He'd done a lot of stories about NHS and the IT. And again, from our point of view, we couldn't tell in expert terms the IT story. What we could do is, if you look at that, look at the people and think, Paul Foote, who was a great journalist at Private Eye, he said, I've got two brilliant ideas. One of them is Rogues Gallery. You just put up all the shits and name them. And I said, what's the other one? And he said, no, that's the same thing. I do that again. And so what we did was, Rebecca identified a lot of the case studies, the human stuff, but we said, just look at these people who are taking the money. The following people are really to blame and are refusing to accept the truth. And at that point, it became more of a Private Eye story. It's just we're cruder. Not necessarily in investigative terms, but that's what the story was.
And can I just say, because it's on the screen there, we've got your Rogues Gallery at the bottom. This is, just to be clear, this is a report from 2020, but this was a pretty long form piece.
Yes, and it was pulling together all the other pieces we'd run, and it's the first time we thought it would be amusing to do a set of first-class stamps to commemorate all the people who'd stolen all the money. So again, the thing we can do is refuse to take them as seriously as they take themselves, and that helps. And then the other thing you can do in a magazine genuinely is just repetition. And a lot of newspapers have a problem in, the editors get bored very quickly and the readers think, oh, we've seen all this, can we move the story on? On a magazine, you do have the advantage, you can just do it again. And your readers trust you, that they think, OK, they'll have something else to say, and we'll stick with it. I always think with magazines, your readers are more of a club. I always think of the Beano. Obviously, that's, it's a bit highbrow compared to the Eye, but you know what I'm saying. There is a sort of loyalty in which they'll stick with you. And Richard was brilliant at essentially repeating it. And we had, like you, we had Alan Bates, who, he's a pretty tough nut. Just one story. Last week I went to lunch with him and he said, I'd like to complain about this week's issue of Private Eye. And I thought, oh, God. And I said, what have we done? He said, there's one page where the post office is not mentioned. You can see why he's survived. He's incredibly funny, and he's right. You've just got to keep doing it.
He's going to complain for 20 years about that page now, you know that.
So, actually, this is such an important point. Chipping away, keeping at it. So, Bryan, probably how many stories did you publish? And I know you've sort of done a count, and I don't know if it's prior to 2019 when there was the High Court victory or whatever time span you want. So you took over in 2009.
In total, since Rebecca's first story, we've done nearly 400 stories in that time. But in the early days, it was slow. There wasn't a lot happening. It was however many people, the original 7 that Rebecca talked to, plus the ones who didn't want to talk, and then 6 months later it was 30 people, and 12 months later it was 50 people. So it was slow, but it was interesting. I mentioned before when I was coming here, I sort of went back through some of those early headlines, and what was interesting is that it's small differences between the early headlines in the stories, but I found it quite amusing to sort of see how it sort of developed and how it showed how it developed. So, like 2011, 55 sub-postmasters discuss legal action against Post Office. October 2011, 85 sub-postmasters seek legal support. 2012, Post Office launches external review of Horizon system. 3rd January 2013, Post Office admits Horizon system needs investigation. Then Post Office wants to get to bottom of Horizon system allegations. Then Post Office Horizon system investigation reveals concerns. And then perhaps with hindsight, the worst headline of any story we ever did, October 2013, end in sight for sub-postmaster claims.
Well, on that topic, let's talk about how friendly the Post Office was. What about any legal challenges? There were stories of calling up editors saying your reporter's rubbish. And I don't know if it's you, they did it to you. Your reporter's rubbish, doesn't know what they're doing. And I know that in 2015, they got more aggressive. So just tell us a little bit about what challenges, if at all, you had.
Yeah. Rebecca's already mentioned. In the initial story, there was a lot of legal loops to go through. The Post Office was very aggressive, personally towards Rebecca as well, complaining about her and that sort of thing. But generally, our day-to-day dealings with the Post Office, they were just constant aggression. It was constant. I don't know why you're pursuing this story. There is nothing in this story. Do not do this. We've subsequently learnt that during those early couple of years, there were some. Broadcasters, national newspapers who did ring the Post Office up and say, I've seen this story in Computer Weekly. I'm just having a look into it, and they've said to them, Computer Weekly is wrong. Do not write this story. There is nothing in it. They are wrong, and that aggression was always there. The only time it turned into an actual formal legal letter was in 2015, and again with hindsight, if you go back and look at 2015. I think that was the time, probably, that the Post Office realised they were screwed. They were really in trouble. It was the year when of the famous Paula Venables, the former CEO of the Post Office, when she was in front of the select committee that was featured in the drama. It was the year when they sacked the forensic accountants, the forensic investigators who had been looking into it, because again, as we know now, they had found loads of evidence to show there was a problem, so they sacked them and bound them under a non-disclosure agreement. So things were starting to turn against them. And at that point, they decided to go for us go for us legally. We had a letter from the Post Office General Counsel, so like their most senior legal person. This was not even if you keep doing this, we might send you a legal letter. This came from their General Counsel. The letter itself was, the claims they were making were just specious. There was no, I'm not a lawyer, but I remembered enough about my media law training to know that there was nothing in the claims that they were doing. But so after a few rounds of discussions with them, they went away. But when that letter first drops through, it's like, oh well, this has gone up a level now.
Yeah, must be true. Ian, I always wonder who actually thinks it's worth firing off a legal letter to Private Eye. Maybe more people than we think. So, were the Post Office ever getting shirty with you?
Yeah, we had the first story Richard ever run. There was immediately a mentally aggressive letter from the Post Office, and as you say, I always think, great, must be true. We're onto something here, and on we go. And we sent our usual reply back, fuck off. It's not put like that, obviously. It's, thank you very much for your letter. We're very much taking your concerns into account. Fuck off. But again, for the Post Office to actually come for you, even by the time we were onto it, would mean a risk for them because things come out. And that is, I'm always a bit over-optimistic about journalism, but even the inquiry, a huge amount came out. People said, oh, the inquiry, nothing will happen. It does. When the wheels come off and people are asked to lie in public, as they are in court, some people won't do it. They'll do it behind the scenes, but you put them up in front. And the Post Office investigators, these supposed hard nuts, started weeping and saying, oh, I should never have done it. And you say, yeah, we know that. You shouldn't never have done it. But the spotlight being on them meant a lot of them confessed. And I was saying to Ros earlier, the fantastic turnaround of seeing, Fujitsu saying we're not going to appear in front of the inquiry, to a man coming on and saying, it's our moral duty to compensate the Post. No, I think, bloody hell, 3 weeks. And you just notice. The legal process, and I add the inquiry bit into that, it doesn't always work well for the complainant. And you've got to remember that. It can be the end for them.
Rebecca, yeah?
Just to add, I just remembered we couldn't mention Fujitsu early on because they were the ones that would sue us. So the only reason that we could run the story at all was the Post Office was a public institution that was very unlikely to sue. So there's another aspect of it.
And was that legal advice you received, or it was you'd had preemptive legal letters, or maybe you don't?
I think we had to put it to Fujitsu. I think we had to let them know about it, but they weren't mentioned in any way. And we had to be very careful not to criticise the IT. That whole point around all IT goes wrong. It's about how it's managed that matters. So yeah.
The irony that was, and I remember you telling me that, and the others on the team telling me about that. The irony was, as Ian sort of implied, throughout this process, Fujitsu were completely supine. We would always go to them for comment, and they'd always be no comment. We'll just refer you to the Post Office. They never said a thing, literally, never said a thing until the drama. And then exactly as Ian says, suddenly their chief executive is up in front of Parliament, and oh yes, we're very, very sorry, and the compensation and all that sort of thing. They'd never said a thing, not a single thing substantive to that point.
Ros, I know we haven't brought you in until now. I was going to say, as media editor at the Sunday Times, you see the whole media landscape, and we know that it wasn't all magazines, as in there were many others who were starting to do good reporting on this. But just listening to the others speaking, have you got any sort of initial observations about it? Because it was chipping away, right? Then Ian sort of made the point, oh, well, newspapers sometimes give up, which they don't always, by the way, but yeah.
Well, it did take newspapers a very long time to pick this up, didn't it? I mean, to do it properly. We're talking years and years and years. We were covering this when I joined the Sunday Times, or a little bit later. My colleague Sabar Meddings actually interviewed Rebecca. And, I remember our then deputy editor, now editor, always saying this was a really important story. But newspapers were incredibly slow on this. And I think there is plenty to learn there, that we could have been quicker. I think there's a massive challenge. And I mean, I've only worked in newspapers, so, I don't have the magazine side to compare it with. But I certainly think you get editor fatigue. I mean, we always sort of say on a Sunday newspaper, you can get editor fatigue between Tuesday when you pitch the story and Sunday when it's supposed to land. And that is such a challenge, i.e. your editor's thinking, oh, well, we know this. And it's like, you know this because I've mentioned this to you on Tuesday. So that is a very tricky thing to deal with. So I think, look, I think this is a triumph for magazine journalism. Newspapers can take a tiny bit of credit towards the end, and obviously an ITV drama that I think one of the reasons for me that I thought it cut through so amazingly and powerfully was that obviously the humanity, these are very human stories, but it really made you think that these were really these were really good people, sort of backbone of Britain type people. When you saw it on screen, I think casting was also excellent. So it was, but there was so much that was good there. But actually, when you look at it, Rebecca had done that in the first place all those years ago. So look, I think this is a lesson for newspapers that we should be smarter about. Obviously, while crediting the original source of it, we should be smarter about following stuff up that is clearly. I mean, what turned out, we're talking about now, the greatest miscarriage of justice. But it was all there for us to do, and we didn't. And look, that does happen. I mean, lots of us have written stories that we've published in a newspaper, and then you think it's just met with sort of tumbleweed, and you think, why has no one else picked this up? And then a month later, the Daily Mail picks it up, it's on their front page, and they submit it, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, for Scoop of the Year. And you were like, well, that was on page 3 of the Sunday Times a month ago. So, it does happen, but I think there's a lesson here. Well, that's an interesting,
by the way, all of you can jump in, but that's an interesting point. If it was on page 3, I mean, Ian, did you promote, I'm not saying you should have done, but did you promote the Post Office on reflection as much as you could have done? You make the Beano joke, but obviously there are some great jokes, and then there's some of your journalism in the bag. Yeah. Could you? I'm not sure if the Post Office would have ever made the cover, for example.
No, I mean I put it on the cover afterwards. But again, I mean I'm putting the cover on the newsstands because I'm trying to sell as many copies as I can with a very brilliant joke, and then people read the stuff inside. And the Post Office, I mean, we gave a lot of space to it. You said
you thought you did a story once a month.
It felt like it,
yeah.
And I'm going to obviously make the case for editors here. Can't think why, but part of what you're doing is you're trying to keep your readers with you, and Richard Brooks, who ran the story, will say there were times when he said, now, I've got a great story about the Post Office, and I'm going, oh, God, again. And I'm just channeling the readers. And he said, and then you say, do I have to put this in? And he says, yes, you do. And you need to be quite firm, I think, as a journalist. And the rewards are huge, but it's a risk with these stories that they don't pick up. And I think I think the drama's terrific, and people say, God, why did you take a drama? Well, that's what drama's meant to do. It's meant to move people and make them act. So I'm all for that. But what we hadn't established was the model, and this has come out in inquiry. So the inspectors found postmasters up to no good because they were paid on commission by how many people they found were no good. The post office directors were paid bonuses by how much money they saved by stopping supposed fraud. If you follow the money, I mean, you followed the tech and you followed the human story, but once you get onto the money, it is absolutely clear what everybody's motivation is right the way through this. So Paula Venel says, I was protecting the brand. And your bonus? Yeah, and mostly your bonus. And at every stage, it's a straightforward commercial decision. Fujitsu, if we admit this thing doesn't work, we're going to have to pay up, and we won't get the next commission. So again, it was turning the outrage into what is the actual story here, is that from the bottom to the top, everyone was acting out of self-interest.
This is Fujitsu's most profitable ever contract in its history in the UK.
And I mean, when I went on that Peston show, and very kind of you to cut it before I went nuts, I just thought, here's this Tory MP and talking about compensation. And I just said, well, I think you should give £1 million to everybody. So that's 1,000 of them, and Fujitsu, they made all this money, they should pay up. And I thought, I have absolutely no grounds for any of those figures. And then I read it the next day. It was in Parliament. Someone said, yeah, we should give about £1 billion. I think, yeah, great, just make it up.
Rebecca.
Just on selling the story to the nationals, it was a hard story to sell. You mentioned accounting software, people glaze over. You mentioned any kind of IT, people glaze over. I think it is just tricky from that perspective as well. And I think we got really close. The only thing that I do wish that had happened, that instead of calling the post office, or in addition to calling the post office to hear them deny it, I wish they'd given Alan Bates a call, because obviously we would have handed out contacts. Because as soon as you speak to Alan Bates, it's very difficult to ignore the story. So I do. That's what I wish had happened, that more people had gone to him rather than just accepting the denials.
Did any journalists contact you?
Well, we contacted them. We got really close with a couple, and then some editor somewhere got cold feet.
But I would say, I've had someone come to me from the BBC say a tech company is shitting all over your story on the front page of the Sunday Times today. What's the truth here? And I said, well, it's completely true. They didn't deny it in our response. You can see the response is on the front page. So, they were saying I was a bad journalist, basically. They were doing what and, if more had done that, we might have got a follow off that. We didn't get any follows. And, that was the only journalist who told me that. They must have said that to every single news journalist. And I would have replied to all of them, if they just messaged me on Twitter or whatever. But no one does that. And I find that really weird thing about our industry.
Is that a sort of lone wolf syndrome, or competition between titles? Is there anything...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, certainly competition. Within anybody's little field, there is competition, let alone competition with nationals and that sort of thing. Everybody wants to think this is our story, and we want to run with it. Everybody gets, you alluded to it earlier, Ros. You said you get this. When somebody, when a national writes a story, calls it an exclusive that you've written a year ago. The start of this year, the Daily Mirror did a front page story. Alan Bates turns down OBE. We literally wrote that story 12 months before. Literally 12 months before.
Just one more thing on the post office. In 2019, there was the High Court victory, which is captured in the drama. And why then, perhaps, did it not electrify in the way it did in 2024? I mean, is it this because the sums of money were relatively small per individual? Was it just computer software again?
It's difficult. I mean, when that happened, certainly we thought, we were convinced, me and my team, this is it. This is going to be the thing. We'd spent all those years up till then. I honestly can't tell you how many times we had the conversations. I can't, between ourselves. Why is this not on the front page of every paper? Why is this not leading the news on the BBC and this sort of thing? And after the High Court, there was interest. It was on a few front pages. It was on a bit of the BBC, and then nothing. Then it just didn't go forward from there anymore. There was another little burst then. 21, when the first of the victims had their convictions quashed, picked up some interest then. There was another panorama about that time again, a really good panorama that Nick Wallace was involved with again. And again, it was like, oh, well, finally, this is going to be it. And still it didn't. Still, it got the coverage then, but it didn't hang. It just, nobody had found the way to really engage the public, to share the sense of outrage that we'd felt for all those years for the victims. And that really was what the drama did. That was the extra bit that the drama was able to do, was just to take that last step to make, to make the greater British public outraged at what had happened. And I think the wider media then had to respond, had no choice.
I was going to say, I think that's absolutely true, but I just wanted to make a point of the magazine end of it and doing the stories. I met 3 or 4 of the postmasters in the last couple of weeks, and one of them said to me, what we got from your magazine, so even, if you hadn't broke the story and the National didn't pick it up, he said, every week I got Private Eye, and I said to my neighbours who thought I was a thief and my relatives, I said, look, someone else thinks I'm innocent. And they're not stupid, which is very kind of him. There's some other stuff in here. And he showed it around. And he said that was fantastically encouraging. It's a strange time. I don't know if you found this. I was walking along Oxford Street, and then someone shouted, "Oi, Ian Hislop!" And I thought, oh, God. It was Lee Castleton.
Oh, really?
And he didn't look like he did on the telly, so I didn't recognise him. But again, he said, what I wanted to thank you for was keeping going. And I said, well, coming from you, you kept going pretty well. But he said it was the idea that somebody else, in a world of magazines and the media, just thought they weren't lying. And that was, so you're doing that, even if the story's not breaking and no one else is doing it, you're keeping the campaigners going. And that in itself is a pretty good service, I think. Yeah.
And Bryan, you've said, maybe Rebecca as well, that what we know is that can then lead to someone else getting in contact. Yeah. That the might not be a snowball, but you can help the trickle of more information. I'd like to change to bring in Ros on her story from last year, the allegations related to Russell Brand. So Ros, this was splashed all over the front page. It was a very powerful story. Tell us a little bit about how the story sort of came, how you and the team got hold of the story.
Yeah, that's right. Team is a really important word there, because I don't think we would have published without the work of my Times colleague Charlotte Wace, who was amazing. And I'm actually on maternity leave, and this story came out when I had a 4-month-old, and I don't think we would have been able to do anything without her, and her work was extraordinary. And also lawyers, always lawyers. So our lawyers were immensely helpful to this getting over the line. It wouldn't have managed it without them. So I should note that I'm incredibly limited on what I'm allowed to say on this, because Russell Brand has been interviewed by the police under caution about 9 historic sexual offences. And that means our laws are such that I wouldn't want to do anything that could jeopardise anything to do with the police investigation. So while he is merrily tweeting and not tweeting, posting on Instagram and posting on Rumble, I meanwhile am not able to say very much, which I think is something quite interesting about British libel law and British laws around contempt and so on. But what I would say is, like many Me Too investigations, with this, there were rumblings a very long time ago. I have done a series of Me Too stories, nothing ever anywhere near this high profile. But it's always the case that there are, when it's a high profile individual who's spoken to the press before, been written about, there are a group of people around that individual who have their suspicions at the very least. And certainly rumours and things that you hear. And that was the root of this, rumours. And I had nothing to go on when I was put on this story. And my editor had nothing to go on. It was mentioned to me that somebody had been saying this at a comedian had been saying as part of their set that about his behaviour towards women in quite extreme terms, libelous terms, or slander, because it would have been in person. But I had absolutely nothing to go on at that stage, and that is why that was 2019. So it did take a very, very long time to come into the world. And one of the challenges is I was doing my day job, and originally, before I had children, I was literally working on my, so we have Mondays off, I was working on my Monday doing work on this because I didn't have time around my job. And that is one of the massive challenges of investigative journalism generally, that, you know, we've still got a paper to fill. Something that takes 4 years is not helping fill that paper very often, which is eventually. But you know, it does take a long, long time to get to publication point in an investigation like that. And also a huge element of luck in that, you know, you have to speak to the right people, and there could be huge numbers of people that you talk to who are not, you know, going to help you, or who aren't going to speak. Some people who would be incredibly helpful to talk to you. So those are the challenges. There's also one specific thing that I want to mention around Me Too investigations. One of the kickbacks we got a lot in this story was, why didn't the Sunday Times go to the police when we had the information? And one thing to say to that was, obviously we didn't have the women's permission to do that. But I noticed we don't really get those kind of kickbacks on other types of stories. So when journalists investigate fraud, say, or say the Michelle Mone thing, you could equally raise that same thing. It's a really specific thing that you get with Me Too stories. And I don't have a right to go to the police. Obviously, you could say, why didn't the women go to the police? I mean, there's plenty of grounds one might argue. People might not want to approach the Met Police about an allegation of sexual assault, particularly in recent years. But I think that's a really specific thing. And the final thing I want to add there is that the police don't proactively investigate things like that. It's not like they go out and say, and also actually a really, really important point on a story like this. So because of what he was accused of, the police have actually never named him, right? So we go to the police and we say, we understand he's been investigated under, for a number of, he's been interviewed under caution for a number of sexual offences. And the police come back and say, a man in his late 40s has been, they don't name him. And so there was no way that the women could have known that they weren't alone. This obviously references the amazing thing which gave me the shivers just watching it back. But I mean, really, when I watched it, in the post office thing, everyone thinks they're alone until they realise they're not. And sometimes the only way that can come out is journalism. It cannot come out from the police. If a woman had gone to the police and said, this is what happened to me, the police wouldn't then say, well, we've interviewed him about a sexual offence. They would be, they wouldn't be putting that out publicly. So the only way certain stories are ever going to come out is investigative journalism. I'm not saying it's a perfect way for it to come out. There are real challenges and problems with it. But this wasn't going to come out through the police.
Rebecca, you were nodding a lot.
Just agree with every word.
I'm not sure I might come back on this theme because it's super interesting. I mentioned collaboration earlier, Ros. Tell us a bit about the collaboration, and it'd be interesting for other people on the panel to also chip in on that, because it wasn't the Sunday Times alone. No,
absolutely not. The Times came on late, but delivered way over the odds in terms of what they brought. And, we are separate newspapers still. Obviously, it's a bit weird a situation because certain teams are merged, but the news operation is entirely separate at both newspapers still. So they were absolutely brilliant, and it's been a joy to get to know my colleague Charlotte there, who has done amazing work on this. And obviously, I was the person who approached Channel 4. My feeling was that given the way he was going at the time, it felt as though this, obviously someone with a very high profile, I felt that we needed, so there's two reasons. Obviously, sharing the legal risk of an investigation like that was important. And the second bit was having people on camera, which is a massive, massive ask and a massive challenge, but having something sort of that people watch, it felt like the kind of story that needed to be told in that way too. But I think there are massive challenges of newspapers working with TV. I think we operate quite differently, and we have different needs and demands. And I think it is actually a really tricky thing to manage well. So, you know, obviously it was a process, and at times it was difficult. I think the end product was you know, more powerful as a result of doing that. But it's not without its challenges working with TV. I mean, they really did want quite different things from what we wanted. And, you know, different demands and different sort of ways of doing things. But I'd never worked with TV before, so, you know, I was sort of learning. I never worked in that way with TV before. So it was a bit of a learning experience, and there are massive challenges there. But I think the problem was this was a story that a lot of newspapers had tried to do on their own. And Me Too stories are very difficult. I mean, Noel Clarke is suing The Guardian over, it is a different kind of story, but you know, it's still under the Me Too umbrella. They're very difficult to do on your own, I think, now. Yeah.
Do you think, or are there a lot of Me Too stories, how can I put it, pending? Or
Yeah, so I have very strong opinions around this, because I think America obviously has quite different libel laws from us, that the onus is on the person who in theory has been libelled to prove that what the person has said about them is not true. This is in very basic terms. Whereas here we would probably rest on a truth defence. Obviously we can also have a public interest defence, but you know, the onus is on us. So I think that's why I felt that in this country we didn't have a Me Too movement in quite the same moment, like a sort of, you know, a breaking off of things, because there were people that people knew about when Me Too all happened. Everyone thought, oh my God, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. That person's finally going to be named. And slowly those people are coming out, but there's still 3 that I can think of at the top of my head, really famous people for whom that has not happened, and I'm sure one of them will be imminent. So, and not by me. I will leave that to colleagues elsewhere. But and actually, one of the nice things, I just want to say on collaboration. There's one thing I realised there was a bit of a problem that you can only do one of these stories, and you know, at one point, another newspaper, when I was actually on my first maternity leave, another newspaper started doing this story, and you work it out really quickly because they contact the same 5. You know, the first 5 people that you went to, they contact, who then message you, and are like, oh, you know that. Well, it was the Guardian. And the Guardian's calling me, and I was like, oh, right, okay. That's fine. It's fine. I think that's okay. I think that's fine. Good for them, but obviously I was like, oh no, you know, I'm gonna have to go back early for my mat leave. But actually, that was a deluded view, because this story took then another 3 years to come out. So that child is now 3. But you know, you panic that they're going to find everything you haven't been able to find. And one thing that really struck me is you only really have capacity to do one of these stories. And the weird thing about doing one is that you'll hear about the other people and maybe find a source accidentally that actually knows about the other person. So I've approached people and they've said, oh, I thought you were going to ask about X. And so what I found is, well, there will be a journalist working on that. And so the nice thing to do, I thought, was I've got a little WhatsApp group of Me Too journalists, and you know, I hope that people share stuff. And certainly there was someone at another paper who shared some stuff with me that they had. None of those things actually ended up anywhere, but it was really helpful because, you know, they'd heard things I hadn't heard. So it gave us something new to chase. But I think there needs to be more collaboration between titles, because ultimately, you know, we all are the kind of people who want stuff in the world. And I get that there's a weird journalism thing about, like, you know, my story, and it's frustrating when other people take the credit. And, you know, Rebecca, you've had a lot of this. You know, she's the brilliant person here, and your editors. But everyone else now thinks, you know, they did something useful. You know, and obviously Ian too. But I mean newspapers. I don't mean magazines. But you know, there is that thing, and I think we need to on my personal views, we need to let go of that a bit and just maybe be a bit more collaborative across the industry.
All right, well, that's a good moment, Shay. Shall we collaborate with the audience? So we've got a roving microphone, so please use it. So if you've got a question, put your hand up. Everyone's very friendly. And maybe we'll start in the front just to start with. And please introduce yourself if it's relevant.
Hello, my name is Chris Green. It's probably relevant. I should explain that Bryan and I used to work together. So the question is, and Bryan, it's probably more for you. I mean, given, obviously, from a legal perspective, Ian, you run a magazine where you're proprietor. When it came down to the legal side of things, it was ultimately your decision whether to go for it. But Bryan, you're at a magazine that's owned by a company that owns a variety of titles. How much of how much was the owner up for the legal fight? How much of a battle was it to persuade them that this was rock solid and we're not going to be dragging you through the courts?
I'm hoping there's nobody from the owner here when I answer this question. I have no formal legal support. We don't have a legal department. The publishing company that owns us is a US publisher. I run all their non-US editorial operations. So everything else that they do, the bulk of what they do is in the US. And as Ros said earlier, the attitudes towards libel and that sort of thing in the States is very different. It almost doesn't exist. First Amendment, all that sort of thing. It's not something they really worry about. So that works for me in two ways. In that, one, if I do go to them and say, we have to do this because British libel laws are really tight, really tough, they go, oh, right, we better do that then. But in all honesty, within these four walls, if our owners and our legal team in the US knew how many legal letters we'd had over the years, if they knew some of the risks we'd taken on investigative journalism, I would probably be in a lot of trouble. So we have to go through it. We have to take the risk sometimes. Since 2009, as you said, since I've been at Computer Weekly, I would say probably on average over that time, I've had maybe a couple of legal letters, or threats of legal letters a year on average. Only once have I actually had to go to the US company and say I need to get a libel lawyer to support us on that, and that was with a story last year. So do your media law training, everybody. I'll tell you that. Do your media law training. But yes, it really is an issue, because I know if I went to them with some of these stories, they would shut them down. Almost certainly, just for the fear of what it would cost. It's a publicly quoted company, all those sort of things around it. That it would be very hard for me to argue against that fear. Their natural instinct commercially would be, do we really have to do this?
And the very first story, we had different owners, and we did have lawyers, and it took months and months, and loads of going back and forth.
And Rebecca, you've spent quite a lot of time being freelance, and stating the obvious, that's an even harder position to be in, right?
From a legal perspective.
I mean, in terms of getting someone willing to publish a tricky story, and the time. I mean, one of the themes of this is it takes time, or it often takes time.
Yeah. You just have to view the investigative stuff as a hobby, an unpaid hobby. Freelance is tricky. It's not. Some people make it work, but it's really hard.
Ian?
We do have lawyers. Many of them have large wings of their houses, which have been paid for by our readers. And yes, I mean, they are very good. I mean, I do realise we do have the advantage of people thinking that we're not scared to do this. So that slightly worries them. But part of it, and Rebecca's read this, is you have to decide, can you be as boring as them? So when you get a very long, detailed letter, you say, that's really good of you. Could you answer the following 98 questions about the internal workings? And obviously, as soon as you've answered all those questions, we'll move on. And sometimes they just disappear. And I mean, it is partly a tactics. And on the slap version, I mean, we had an incredibly long, boring letter from the lawyers representing a man called Mr. Mercy, who's been taking out a lot of slap injunctions against an ex-Tory MP and trying to close down books and all sorts of things. And he sent an incredibly detailed letter from his lawyers saying, my family does not own a trust in the Cayman Islands. It's in the Virgin Islands. I haven't transferred all the money to my son. It's to his brother. And I'm paraphrasing. So we said, can we print all of this? Because it's fascinating. And then they said no. So there are ways of just trying to turn the tables in terms of the power between those two. But fighting libel actions is very expensive. and very time-consuming. And for a freelance and for a small publisher, I'm just amazed how much you get away with and impressed. Because it's, again, all the panel have said the same thing, but Ros said even with the magazine, you've got to fill its pages. So if you've got a story that's taken someone 6 months to do, and you say, is it ready to run yet? And they go, no. I mean, that's a large investment in, salary, income, whatever, for nothing. And then at the end of 9 months, they may say it doesn't pan out.
Or in Ros's case, you get the most read story ever on the Sunday Times website. Is that correct?
And that's the risk.
Yeah,
isn't it?
but I mean, I actually weirdly thought it was an advantage that I was on maternity leave because I didn't have to write other things for the paper. So the last 4 months, I could actually, obviously I was also looking after a baby, but I actually had in a weird way, I had the time to do it, which is insane when you think about it. I mean, and it shouldn't really, it shouldn't quite take that shit. I always think Private Eye has one advantage, which I hope is true, is that most people don't want to be the horrendous individual, I hope, who sues Private Eye, because, who closes it down. But I suspect there are people so awful that they would happily be
that. I think a lot of people wouldn't mind.
Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. Can maybe go to another question? And so should we go to the back this time?
Okay, hi, Greg Williams from Wired. In the sort of spirit of collaboration and chipping away on stories that we've heard from the panel today, I'm just wondering if you could maybe just share sort of like a story you think that's out there in plain sight right now that everyone should be thinking about and pursuing. Like, Ian, I'm thinking, I'm a Private Eye subscriber, the work you've been doing on Teesside and the Freeports, which is absolute scandal as far as I can tell. I'm not sure if anyone else is following that up, so I'm just interested to see if the group, if there's a story out there you're covering and you're interested in, do you think that there should be sort of like more, sharing and collaboration on, to Ros's point? That's generally to everyone, but, maybe...
Yeah, no. From my point of view, yes. I mean, that story should be out there, and I'm, approaching ITV for the drama right now, and I think Toby Jones is playing me. So I'm very, very excited about. But it is true, and that story isn't being followed up to the extent that the Times ran a leader. You may have noticed this about 3 weeks ago, saying Private Eye's allegations are all untrue. And extraordinarily, they have now issued a correction, which they printed quite small, and I printed fucking huge, saying, no, actually, what we printed was right. So, no, I am waiting for that one to set fire. But again, the nice Labour MP who brought it up in the Commons, they're really after him. And, that's a very difficult story. And they are... it's a very rich corporation, and they're very lawyered up. And is it a complicated story? I don't think it is a very complicated story, but it hasn't caught. Anyway, I'm sure there are plenty of others.
Yeah, I could tell you a complicated story, which again is slightly. I'm slightly restricted what I can say about it because there are reporting restrictions on it at the moment. But to try and again, it's complex because it's computers. But in essence. His story is that there are hundreds of very bad people going through the courts in the UK at the moment, drug dealers, organised crime people who were caught because they all used a special purpose-built encrypted mobile phone that the French intelligence services hacked without them knowing, and spent 18 months basically listening to all their conversations and taking copies of all their text messages. And now, then they came out, hundreds of people were arrested, there's lots of court cases going through at the moment, but there is a very real suggestion that the way that information was gathered was not legal. So if it were to be proved that information was not gathered according to the laws that say what governments can intercept or read of electronic communications, you could find hundreds of very, very bad people walking free very soon.
Did you want to go? You sure? Yeah. We know Ros has warned us in a really good way that there's more Me Too stuff to come out, which is going to be interesting. Yeah, you've said. But
one thing that's always struck me as somebody really needs to look at is children's homes, the privatisation of them and the abuse that goes on in them. And it's going to be a grim thing if someone does that properly. It's really difficult, obviously, because you have sources that are underage, and I've done one story of that, and I couldn't get it published because the people who got in touch with me were 16, and actually that story did eventually got flushed out a slightly weird way, but I think that's a scandal waiting to happen. These providers charging crazy money to look after sort of 5 kids in these homes, and there's, and like with all these things, there's someone who bangs on about this all the time on Twitter. I think he's a hero, and I think that's something that is an area that I keep thinking, God, someone's got to look at that.
Our next question, so a couple all around the place, so, and then we'll go to the back.
Really inspiring chat. Sorry, Tim Pollard from Bauer Media. Really inspiring chat tonight. I'm interested in hearing a particular line from Ros about the most read story on the Sunday Times website, because I worry a little bit about, you hear about the BBC sort of resources, their funding for investigative journalism going down, you hear about journalism. Can you tell us a little bit more about the success it brings? If you get a really good cover story in, or a Sunday Times story, it's really heartening if we can go back and take that away and understand there's business success as well. Because I worry about the business case for investigative journalism.
It's the hard thing is, we've done some within our field was some really good investigative stuff put aside the post office over the years, broken a lot of big stories about government IT cock-ups and all that sort of thing. And they don't always get the most traffic. There's no two ways about it. They have the most impact because they're the ones that people talk to me about. They're the ones that people come up to me and say, "Oh, I saw your story about such and such. That was great. Really interesting." But that there is that constant fight between. It depends on what your business model as a publication is, but there is always that constant battle between we need to be writing stories that people are going to be clicking on, that are high volume, which generally are pretty dull, boring. In our field, it's right about Apple, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Which our mostly professional audience are not remotely interested in, fortunately. So yeah, they're not always the biggest hits. Ros's one, obviously there's a huge general interest around a celebrity, which makes a big part of it. Post office, obviously fantastic. Since in January, the traffic boost we had as a result after the drama was out of this world. The amount of we probably got more, almost as much traffic in January to our historic post office articles than we probably did in the previous 5 years put together. So Ben, thank you. But it can take time.
Ian, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean the 3 issues around the post office, we sold a lot of copies, and I'm very grateful for that. But I do think also with you get a real long-term benefit, so that if you're in trouble, or if people think the magazine's a bit rubbish this week, or you haven't done anything interesting for a while, they will think, well, at least you did the post office, or at least you banged on about Teesside, or at least one other story I read in the last year was worth it, and someone was there. And we do. I mean, readers do say this. I get letters saying. I was getting very bored of you, but then last week you ran a story it was actually about special needs and about the failure of provision there. And as editor, I probably hadn't thought that's the top story I've put in. But out there, someone's thinking, good, I'll stick with you because you bothered to do that. And that's not an immediate on the balance sheet, but it is a huge plus.
Well, Rebecca, did you expect 15 years after your story that you'd be appearing in the opening episode of a primetime drama? I did ask you how you felt about being portrayed. I was glad to see a magazine journalist making it in. Yeah. They forgot that bit in the ITV sizzle reel where they were, Power TV, but it started with magazine journalism. Next question. We don't have that much time left, so yeah.
I'll be brief. Andy Verity from the BBC. I'm old enough to remember that actually we're part of a great tradition here. Exposing miscarriages of justice through journalism and drama goes back, for example, to Who Bombed Birmingham in 1990, starring Martin Shaw from The Professionals. I'm sure you remember. Now, there have been several different documentaries before that. World in Action got into it, and they turned it over. Chris Mullin was the journalist exposing that, wrote a book called Who Bombed Birmingham. But it wasn't until John Hurt got together with Martin Shaw and various other people, and they did Who Bombed Birmingham, that suddenly there was a massive impetus behind it. And that's what actually led to the founding of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which sent the cases back most recently and doesn't have an uncheckered history. Andy Malkinson will testify. And Tom Hayes will testify.
Yeah.
People want to ask about another story like this. I'm afraid this is part of a pattern of politicised prosecutions. Under pressure from the tabloid press, they prosecuted the Birmingham Six. Under pressure from the tabloid press, they prosecuted Winston Silcott. Under pressure from a load of flam about postmasters nicking stuff out the till, they prosecuted the postmasters. And under pressure from the public to find someone to blame for the financial crisis, they prosecuted 37 traders and brokers who were actually only doing their jobs. Among them is Tom Hayes and Carlo Palumbo. Their cases will come up in the Court of Appeal next year. But it took a big fight, just like with the sub-postmasters, to bring that to light. Now, I've written about this for the BBC, and I have the same experience that you had, Ros, that I put it up there. I do the research, and I put it up there. Bank of England implicated in LIBOR manipulation. Banks have fined $9 billion, been fined $9 billion for something that actually the US courts have decided wasn't even against the rules. That's incredible. But hang on, Bank of England was implicated. Aren't people interested in that? I wrote that. I thought everybody would be interested. Why didn't they follow up? I think I know why. They didn't have the evidence. Okay, so a journalist can only follow up if they have the evidence. But if we collaborate ICIJ style and upload our evidence with hyperlinks so that everybody else can look at it, then it becomes like science. Everyone else can try to knock it down, and the more they try to knock it down and fail, the more true it becomes. Shouldn't journalism be more like that? In each instance, the desire for an exclusive and the desire to poo-poo a story which isn't an exclusive militates against us collaborating to expose a scandal like this.
Can I answer on that?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the classic thing I always think is, so I broke that, so I had a, well, let's call him a whistleblower, but somebody leaked Operation Yellowhammer, which was the no-deal planning, for no-deal Brexit planning to me. And I knew exactly, because it's the exact pattern that always happens. So we put it all out there, and the next day, of course, all the papers, including our sister paper, basically ran with the denials as, that's day two, right? I think it's a real problem of political journalism, particularly, that very often the story, the first day is the story, and day two, the most easy way to follow up is to say, oh, this is old. Well, it wasn't old. Literally in the third sentence of our splash was the fact that it was August 2019? Yeah, August 2019. It literally said that in the third sentence. Yet, next day, it's an old planning document. Everything's moved on, as though we were really going to fix no-deal Brexit planning in a month anyway. But, you know, so I think there's a massive problem there that, one, I mean, yes, there's a pressure to fill newspapers and to follow something, and if you can't come up with anything better, we'll kick it, you know, give a kicking to the story the next day, even though the story was right. But I think there's another thing that sort of is very frustrating about how things sort of get shot down. You say that people didn't have the evidence to follow it. Well, I would point out, everyone just ripped off everything we did on Mr. Brand, right? They didn't have any of the evidence. They didn't have any of the women. And actually, it's a weird thing that I think about a lot, that if it came to it, you know, what legal protection do they have? I agree. I mean, I covered the Tom Hayes story a tiny bit in the past, nothing like the work you did in it, but obviously I've read all your stuff on that. And the thing is, I completely agree. I think it's also that it's a really complicated story. And people struggle. I think, you know, unfortunately, probably with Tom Hayes, people sort of glazed over a little bit, whereas when they got... And it's depressing. Yeah, it's really depressing. And I think one of our challenges is, you know, I mean, you guys obviously did manage it. Yeah, the challenge is to get people really interested and keep them interested.
I mean, I entirely accept all you're saying, but there is sometimes it's just what is the content of the story, and the story about some bankers have had a miscarriage of justice. Difficult to get people to care. they're not top of the list. You know, I mean, your next thing will be estate agents. You know, they're having a really, really grim time. You know, that's a hard sell. You know, postmasters and mistresses, you know, they are sort of everybody's parents. They're what everyone wants England to look like. You know, that was an easier sell. And I think that's true. I mean, you mentioned one of those documentaries. I mean, do you remember the Carl Bridgewater one? There was a wonderful moment in that, which it was a miscarriage of justice, and our journalist Paul Foote was in it, and Paul Foote was in the drama, played by Angus Deaton, unbelievably. And Paul, Angus, goes into a phone booth, picks up the phone and says, "Hold the front page." And Paul Foote said to me, "You've never given me the front page." You know, page 88 is about as good as it gets. And I think that is one of the differences between real journalism and dramatisations, is it's slower and it's not quite so dramatic, and there's more paperwork. But I do accept it. It's a long tradition. This isn't new. And I think the collaboration between journalism providing the facts and then the drama making the drama is good, and we should all welcome that.
Just as a related comment, we were chatting about this a little bit beforehand. As somebody who's not in national media and not in broadcasters, my perception from the outside was one of the reasons why the Post Office scandal never got picked up was because it was never interested political reporters. It was always written about by business reporters and was on page 45 in the business section. What the drama changed in media terms is the political reporters started writing about it, and now it's on the front page every day. Not having worked in there, I don't know, but my perception is there is a big culture in national media where once the political reporters are on it, this is a big story and we've got to run with it and put it on the front page every day.
Some might suggest, having never been a political reporter myself, I can say this, never worked in the lobby, although I have covered, I covered Brexit, so that was obviously a very political story, but never from the lobby. Might suggest to people that the political reporters have too much, and political editors have too much power at national newspapers. So I would, and that there are plenty of other reporters who are not doing, what's that? And in broadcasting, I'm sure it's true too. Yeah, I mean, I've not worked there, but yes. And I think we should think about that because, quite a lot of the things that normal reporters do, actually the lobby works very differently and very separately from other reporters. My colleagues are my fellow reporters at the Sunday Times, whereas I think the lobby, as in the people, who I sit next to the desk, the health editor or the... whereas I think there is a thing with the lobby where they see, some of them, I don't mean everybody here, and I don't want to tar everybody with the same brush here, but some of the lobbies see their colleagues as the political reporters at other newspapers. And so you can get momentum behind something because, hey, the Mail is putting it on page 1 and we know that tomorrow says Daily Telegraph political editor say, for example. And then they can do the flip side to their editor. I'm imagining a scenario. But, I couldn't say, hey, the Guardian, I don't know, the Observer's media correspondent is going to put, because I've no idea what she's, what she's up to. And I, yes, I think we should all be more collaborative. But I think we should also think about the groups that operate in journalism and the effects that might have.
I think that's quite right. And
Mike, please.
Story, turning it into a story about Ed Davey. Oh, sorry. It wasn't very interesting, and you didn't miss much. I'm just saying turning it into a political story meant that it got a new set of legs. So suddenly a set of papers could say it's all the fault of the Lib Dems. The Daily Mail didn't notice that the Lib Dem was Minister for the Post Office for a while, and then there were a string of others who were all Conservatives. They didn't mention that, and still haven't. But I think Ros is absolutely right. That's when it turns, when people see some interest for themselves in it. But that's useful. So, I'm not against that. It gets it all up and out there. And
I think, Ros and Rebecca, were you saying that there seem to be more men in certain types of role as well? I don't know if it's investigative reporting and so on. I guess you need a diverse mix of people to get a better quality of reporting.
like rich white men. That's
massive problem. So I think...
And the problem there is?
Well, I think the Telegraph has a female investigations editor, so that's, it's not that it's only, but it is noticeable that most of the people working in investigative roles exclusively, I mean, look, all of us on the Sunday Times as reporters, we are doing investigative work, but we're also filling a newspaper, apart from, the people in Insight. So they are, aiming only to do big investigations, which they do brilliantly. But I do think we should think about the fact that investigative journalism is dominated by quite a specific form of journalist, and i.e. a white man of a certain age, and work out, we're probably missing things as a result of that. Just the fundamental point of having diverse voices always, in every way, at newspapers and magazines, that's always going to be a positive. There's going to be stories we miss if we allow that to happen.
Yeah, and I don't know if it plays into how different groups of people get listened to. So you were talking about it obviously with respect to Me Too, but I wonder if it played a role in the fact that the postmasters were effectively ignored for so long and the post office was believed. I don't know, but it's sort of interesting to think about.
I'm tempted to say we should start to draw it to a close, unless someone has a burning question which is super short. We're not allowed long questions anymore, please. I've got one. Okay, maybe we'll take both questions at once. Could you want to take your one at the front, the one at the back, first? So to ask the question.
Hi there, Jamie from Pulse magazine. As a B2B magazine editor, this made me really proud to be a B2B magazine editor, and it's been a fantastic panel as well. Just a very quick one for you, Bryan, especially, and maybe Rebecca as well. When you've got a story like this that should be the splash on the Sunday Times, how do you manage that tension of having to write to your readership, but knowing that it's real public interest there, that the public will be interested in this?
Yeah, it's. There have certainly been times when it's been hard to keep motivated, to keep things going. From our perspective, the thing that all really kept us going throughout this, and this sounds like it might sound cheesy thing to say, but it's absolutely true, is just talking to the victims. No matter what little interest the scandal story was getting elsewhere, you don't take one conversation with an Alan Bates or a Lee Castleton or a Joe Hamilton to think, we have got to do that. We've got to find this next story. We've got to find this next story. So long as there is a chance that this one more story might lead to something that will help these people, then you've got to go with it. But yes, I completely acknowledge how hard it is, and I'm sure with the sort of stuff that the Pulse does, you must write tons of stuff where you're sitting there thinking as well, what have we got to do to get people to realise this is a big thing? And it's really hard.
Good answer. So you've got to be super quick. Sorry, but only just because you're last, that's all.
No, that's okay. Hi, I'm Josh. I'm just a student, so I'm going to try and make this as brief and as possible.
Don't play yourself down.
Thank you. This is mostly for Rebecca and Ros, but I guess more broadly as well. The thing, I guess, I've not had any experience with investigations, so the thing that fascinates me so much is how do you go from rumours and a bunch of people who think they're alone into getting those people to trust you and turning it into one big story? I guess that's the crux of that question. Thank you.
A lot of hard work, being available. One of the challenges, not everyone in our story was in the UK, and I was taking phone calls at weird hours. I'm still doing it now because obviously there's other things going on in this story. Just being available, that, ultimately what we were asking of the women was a really brave thing to do and a really difficult thing to do. And even if you're not being named, it's still, and people, sometimes don't really like journalists, so there's often a lot of work to do there. Sometimes they do, but, getting somebody to trust you means you have to be somebody who's trustworthy. And, I don't think I got everything right. I should say that, I think there was things I got wrong on that story. It's very difficult when someone goes silent on you, which happens a lot on Me Too stories. It's difficult to know if you should keep messaging them, if that's an appropriate thing to do, if there comes a point when you should stop. And, you might be dealing with somebody who's vulnerable in a way that you don't know about, and that's something you always kind of have to keep in your mind. And so, if someone goes quiet, what is the right approach? And another thing that I keep thinking about is, I don't actually have any specific training for dealing with trauma and is in other people's trauma. And, you want to be a good person, do the right things. And I keep thinking that we need really specific for that. I mean, it's quite niche work, but, because you don't want to say something ever that's the wrong thing in that situation, because this is often, I'm dealing with someone, I'm talking about the thing that's the worst thing that ever happened to them. Someone told me they had never told another person what had happened to them apart from me. And you think, what qualifies me to hear this? Well, I don't know. I'm still juggling and I'm still sort of dealing with those things. I don't quite have answers. Maybe other people are cleverer than me on that point. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really complex and it's hard to feel like you're doing it right. It's like a constant learning experience. Obviously, we had to get loads of proof to back up what they were saying. So I guess there was lots of explaining why we needed things. Yeah, trying to explain the whole process as we went, explaining why it was taking so long. Yeah, probably we all need training to speak to people who have been through really traumatic things, because it is potentially quite damaging if you get it wrong. So yeah, it's tricky. It's really hard.
Very good question. And I'm going to ask Bryan and Ian also, just as the closer, really, because I guess answering the same question, but with all stories, winning trust is a key thing that journalists need to do and retain trust. And I don't know if there's a other tip or that may about how you just go about it. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems that you often come across is that the people who are coming to you who think they've got a story, sometimes they have, sometimes haven't. One of the hardest things is to stop yourself from saying to them, "That's not how journalism works," because they don't care how journalism works. Obviously, they just want justice, accountability, their story to be told, whatever it is. It comes back to what Rebecca said about that first story, that first letter from Alan Bates in 2004. He was the only person who was saying it. We now know he was right. We now know that was the seed of the biggest miscarriage of justice in British legal history. But the way journalism works, he was only one person, so you couldn't. There was nothing that could be done about it. Trust is earned over time. Trust is earned over time. One of the reasons we got this story was because Computer Weekly had built up trust among its readership for having done investigative journalism before that had exposed things in the past. So there's a trust that comes with the brand that you're working for as well. But at the end of the day, it's just we all have to remember as journalists, we're all thinking, what's the story? I've got to fill a paper. What's the story here? You just got to remember these are human beings. They're people. After we've talked to them, they're going to go home to their families and possibly have a cry. And I think you just build up trust with them the way I would hope you'd build up with any other human being who is in trauma.
I'm going to say, Ian, last word from you.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all that, but and certainly to Ross. I mean, when I was 5, one of the first stories I ever did, 1984, was a Me Too story about a man at the BBC, and I got the tip because a girl I was at college with had joined the BBC, and was suddenly confronted by this appalling predatory man. And the thing I suppose I learned then, and I think that would be my answer to you, is one of the ways to earn people's trust is to admit that you're a journalist. You're not a social worker. You're not their mum. You're not the police. In the end, you are offering a way to get this story out. You're not offering resolution or closure. None of those things are in your power. What you're offering is a platform for whatever has happened for you to go to a wider audience. And I think if you establish that, then you don't get into, this sounds very glib, but you don't get into those areas of people expecting a vast amount too much of you, because that is what the job is. And there are other people who are very well trained in doing this who will do it better than we will. But they won't do it. They won't do any other bit. We can do the bit we can do. That's what I would
we're
say.
not trained counsellors. I have actually said that exact same sentence very generally, but and I think it's really important. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say thank you so much to these great speakers. Thank you. So, I just want to say, so just I'll only be a minute. I know it's. Thank you everyone for staying with us. I've loved it. It's been brilliant. So again, just thank you to Rosamund, Ian, Rebecca, and Bryan. Thanks to the Bankside Hotel autograph collection. Thank you. Thanks to all of the BSME people. There's lots of people from the committee here. That's editors of all different kinds of titles. And also from the team, Juliet, David, Natalie, Marie, and Iona. There's still time to enter the BSME Talent Awards 2024. Okay, the deadline is next Monday. Go to bsme.com. Editors can't enter, but their teams can. So, go put forward your budding 24-year-old or 26-year-old. But actually, we've had some, how can I put it, journalists with more, of an older age looking to apply. So what can I say? We're open to all. There are other exciting events coming up. We're going to do something on subscriptions and subscription strategy, and not just giving it away. And the art of the cover. So lots more to come during the year. And just again, thanks all for listening.